We've just explored how Durkheim's ideas rippled outwards, influencing sociological thought globally. Now, let's zoom in on a fascinating consequence of that spread, the very act of translation itself. We're looking at les formes élémentaires de la vie religieuse, elementary forms of the religious life, and specifically, how it landed differently when translated into English. So, we start with St. Jerome way back in the day, basically saying, "Hey translators, you're messing with the ancient books, adding stuff? Changing things? That's forgery." It sounds dramatic, right? But think about it when we say, X said, like Durkheim said this, what are we really doing? We're using a shortcut. Jerome wrote his famous line in Latin, but the English words we use to quote him, those were added by someone else. So, Exed isn't pointing directly to the original text, it's pointing to a version of it, a made-to-say version. Every translation, therefore, is actually hosting two ghosts: the original author's words and the translator's interpretation or reconstruction of those words. They're always distinct, always interacting in complex ways. Okay, so how do we unpack these relationships between the original and its translations? The author breaks it down into three main categories. First, circumstantial relationships. This is about the when and why. Why was it translated? When? Second, active relationships. This gets into the nitty-gritty of the translator's craft, how they actually find equivalent words and phrases. Third, interpretive relationships. These are the deeper, sometimes more subtle, meanings that get shaped or revealed through translation, like how terms like conscience or representation carry specific weight. And along the way, we'll also touch on some interesting translation challenges that aren't even cross-language, like retranslating from English to English, as seen with Aaron quoting Durkheim extensively. Let's kick off with purpose. Think about Talcott Parsons. He translated bits of elementary forms for his own massive theoretical work, The Structure of Social Action. His translations weren't standalone, they were embedded within his argument. They served his interpretation. Same goes for translators rendering Aron or Levi-Strauss. But then you have collections like Pickering and Redding's Durkheim on religion, or abridgments like Cladis and Cosmans. Their main goal? Making Durkheim accessible to English speakers. But here's the catch. Unlike Parsons, their purpose wasn't primarily interpretation. So, while they definitely interpret, making choices about what to include or exclude, they also inevitably make not-to-say things. They shape the reader's experience by deciding what's essential and what can be left out. It's a different kind of relationship to the original. Now, let's talk about time. Joseph Ward Swain's translation came out in 1915, just 3 years after the French original. It was the first full English version. Presumably, Durkheim himself had a hand in shaping it, maybe even dropping the subtitle about Australian totemism. But fast forward 80 years to the author's own retranslation in 1995. What a difference! The author benefited from decades of scholarship, Parsons' critiques, specialized readings, and crucially, fieldwork by anthropologists like Evans Pritchard and Malinowski. These later works didn't just explain Durkheim. They changed how we understood him, often by clarifying aspects of his theory through empirical evidence. Think about Evans Pritchard's work on Azande witchcraft. It powerfully demonstrated the very mechanisms Durkheim described in elementary forms. Time brings new perspectives, new data, and inevitably, a different relationship to the original text. Time does just bring new knowledge, it shapes our reactions too. People reading elementary forms in the early 20th century reacted differently than we might today. Back then, the idea of studying religion through primitive forms was controversial. Some folks, like Gaston Richard, a former Durkheimian critic, attacked it fiercely, arguing Durkheim was replacing the individual soul with a cold, collective society, using Aboriginal Australians as the prime example. It felt like a betrayal of common sense, even colonial assumptions. Interestingly, the author notes that today's readers might be similarly primed against Durkheim's project. We see the potential biases in his evolutionary language. Think about the heat surrounding the book. T.S. Eliot reviewed a critique of it, defending individual religion against Durkheim's collective approach. Parsons mentioned instantaneous indignation from religious circles. Even Aaron noted violent reactions in France. History clearly colors how we receive these texts. This historical context feeds directly into the language itself. Durkheim needed terms like élémentaire and simple to frame his methodological approach, starting with the basics. But words like inferior, and primitive, often used interchangeably with them in that era, carried heavy evolutionary baggage. They suggested a hierarchy, a ladder of human development. Swain, aiming for literalness, sometimes amplified this effect. Take les religions même les plus inférieures. Swain translated it as even the most inferior religions. That's a pretty strong word, isn't it? Stronger than the standard lowest we might expect. This literal choice, the author argues, subtly pushes Durkheim closer to thinkers like Lévi-Brühl, despite Durkheim's differences. The author tried to fix this in their own translation by using simplest, thinking it was more accurate, but forgot to add a note explaining why, potentially confusing readers further. See how tricky this gets? Swain's commitment to literalness sometimes led to choices that, while technically accurate, missed the nuance. A big one was his translation of confondre and its relatives, almost always rendering them as confuse. Now, confuse can imply a lack of rational understanding, which fits perfectly into caricatures like Richard's Blackfellows, who say I am a kangaroo meaning something empirical. But confondre has another meaning, to amalgamate, to meld. Think about Lévi-Strauss, via Needham, talking about sacrifice implying solidarity between officiant, god, and animal. He says the asafdir of sacrifice bears within it the germ of a confusion with the animal. Is that an empirical confusion? No, it's a blurring, a merging of categories. Here, fusion or meld would capture that better than confuse. Swain's choice, while understandable, can skew the meaning towards a simpler, less sophisticated view. Another instance where literalness meets interpretation is with obscure consciences. Swain translated it straightforwardly as obscure minds. Seems okay, right? But wait, obscure to whom? To the people Durkheim was writing about, or to us, the readers? The author wrestled with this. After checking the surrounding text and consulting dictionaries, they felt Durkheim wouldn't have meant the native is obscure. Instead, the obscurity was relative to the observer, likely the European scholar. So, in their translation, they added to us with a note explaining the reasoning. Why? Because Durkheim's real goal, despite the evolutionary language, was universalism, showing how similar structures underpin all human societies. The translator, then, has a duty to help contemporary readers grasp that deeper destination, not just repeat potentially misleading phrases from the past. Now, let's remember the mindset of Swain's time. Literalness wasn't necessarily seen as flawed. It could be seen as accurate, especially if it preserved foreign structures. Glassman gives an example from Bible translation. Seminarians appreciated versions that sounded authentic and exercised their Greek grammar. Swain's translation often does this with French syntax and vocabulary. Look at this sentence. The mental habits it implies prevented men from seeing reality as their senses show it to them. But as they show it, it has the grave inconvenience of allowing of no explanation. See how it's clunky in English. It's literally translating inconvenient as inconvenient and packing in those French its. Plus, there are false cognates, words that look similar but mean different things. Swain frequently used assistant for the French assistant, reflecting older English usage, where assistant could mean male assistant. These weren't errors per se, but features of the linguistic landscape Swain navigated. But time pressure matters too. Swain finished his translation relatively quickly, defending his dissertation just a year later. This rush shows. An anonymous reviewer in 1918 noted it was good but less literary finish than the original. Beyond style, there were substantive omissions. Swain occasionally skipped passages, and notably, he deleted a quite important section. Now they cannot weaken without the sacred beings losing their reality, because the sacred beings exist only in and through their representations. Given the implications of this statement about the nature of belief and reality, the author wonders if this was just a mistake, or perhaps a subtle bit of graffiti on Durkheim's wall. It makes you wonder how much of a translator's own perspective, consciously or unconsciously, influences what gets included or excluded. And then there's the monster sentence. This passage, about nothing coming from nothing, and the limits of perception, really stumped Swain. He couldn't quite translate the core concepts étendu extended and inattendu unextended accurately while keeping the flow. So he abandoned his usual literal approach for accuracy. Look at the result. Nothing is worth nothing. Out of the visible, only the visible can be made. Out of that which is heard, we cannot make something not heard. Worth nothing? Visible for sensible, heard for extended? Nope. 60 years later, Pickering and Redding tried vast and minute, still not right. The author argues that for Durkheim's original audience, especially educated ones, étendu/inattendu was likely clear, possibly echoing Descartes' res extensa/res cogitans. Swain's struggle here highlights how difficult it can be to convey precise philosophical concepts across languages, especially when dealing with foundational ideas. Okay, moving on to the active relationship, devising equivalents. Let's take Durkheim's famous definition of religion. The French reads, Une religion est un système solidaire de croyances et de pratiques relatives à des choses sacrées, c'est-à-dire séparées, interdites, croyances et pratiques, qui unissent en une même communauté morale, appelée Église, tous ceux qui y adhèrent. Swain translated it as, a religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden. Parsons offered, a religion is an integrated system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is separate and taboo. Notice the differences? Unified versus integrated for solidaire. Set apart versus separate for séparé. Both are valid, both capture the essence, but they subtly nudge the meaning. Goldenweiser used integral and separated. Aaron's translators used interdependent and apart. Each translator makes a choice, adding their own slight flavor, even if none betray the original intent. The French itself, the author suggests, is deliberately agnostic on some points, leaving it to the translator to choose the best fit. Sometimes the divergence isn't because the original is open to interpretation, but because it's obscure. Take Durkheim contrasting philosophers and erudits. What exactly is he getting at? Different translators render the nuance differently. Swain talks about disdain of scholars, Redding mentions other scholars ignored it, the author opts for disdain of savants, and Cosman uses specialists. All plausibles, but different interpretations arise from the same slightly vague passage. Then there's when the original hints at the author's own sensibility, but stops short. Consider Durkheim describing early gods using planar soar. Were they soaring high above, looking down from on high, or looming menacingly? The context suggests they were near protective, refuting the fear-made gods idea. But the exact feeling? Swain chose soar high above, Redding looked down, while the author and Cosman went with loom. We can't know Durkheim's precise feeling, so the translators make a judgment call, revealing their own interpretation of the scene. So, what is translation? It's both a product and a process. As a product, it looks like the original text, just in a new language. This can easily lead us to think of translation like mediumship. The translator just channels the author's voice. But the author insists it's more like artisan work. Translation is fundamentally a reconstruction. It requires interpretation, judgment, and rebuilding the text in a new linguistic and cultural context. St. Jerome knew this when he talked about translators adding and changing. The original doesn't dictate the translation like a spirit dictating scripture. It sets constraints, provides inspiration, but the translator actively constructs the final version. That's why we get different valid translations of the same text, because the translator's skill and choices are central to the process. Interestingly, sometimes non-literal translation can be brilliant. Swain, despite his general literalism, nailed the tone in places. Take Durkheim's term absurdité foncière, fundamental absurdity, when criticizing simplistic views of primitive thought. Swain rendered it as thoroughgoing idiocy, boom, captures the dismissive, almost contemptuous tone perfectly. Another example, Durkheim's rhetorical question at the end of Chapter 2, Book 1. What sort of science, whose principal discovery would consist in making vanish the very object it treats? Swain translated it as, what sort of science is it whose principal discovery is that the subject of which it treats does not exist? Now, technically, Swain changed consisterate would consist to as weakening the conditional doubt, and does not exist is stronger than faire évanouir make vanish. But the impact, huge. Swain's phrasing, especially the stark does not exist, landed powerfully in the 1950s debates about religion's validity. It shows how a translator's choices, even seemingly minor ones, can resonate deeply with the audience of their time. Well, Werkmeister, a Kant scholar, put it bluntly, any translation is automatically an interpretation. To succeed, you need more than just linguistic skill. You need to understand the author's viewpoint, their destination, and the path they believe leads there. The translator's job isn't to decide where the author should go, or what arguments they should use, but to grasp and convey the journey the author intended. Before diving deeper into the specifics of elementary forms, the author lays out their own understanding of Durkheim's argument. He uses the very case that seems most unfavorable to his theory, totemism with its confusing human-non-human boundaries, to prove that religion is about real, observable phenomena and expresses universal human traits. This requires accepting socially constructed knowledge and reality. Therefore, the ethnographic examples aren't just illustrations. They're crucial for explaining the theory and suggesting empirical work. Getting this wrong skews the entire reading. This brings us to a key passage, the description of the Warramunga men's ritual celebrating their descent from the mythical giant snake Walunqua. This comes from Spencer and Gillen, quoted by Durkheim. Its placement is telling. It's right in the middle of a chapter synthesizing arguments, right before Durkheim dives into abstract thought, and right after he discusses the effervescence of the French Revolution. He's drawing a parallel between Australian and French collective experiences. But the real kicker. What follows this vivid description is Durkheim's argument that the very logic needed for abstract thought is present in the fusions and confusions of this ritual. It's a high-wire act. The passage itself is incredibly powerful, painting a picture of intense, rhythmic movement and sound. Both Swain and the author tried to capture this intensity. Swain rendered the scene with attention to detail and rhythm. While fires were lighted on all sides, the Uluru knelt down one behind the other. Rising from the ground, they went around it, uttering at each movement a piercing cry, a veritable yell, "Shh, shh." The author took a few more liberties for impact. With fires flickering, the Uluru knelt in single file. At the same time, they moved their bodies left and then right, at each movement letting out an echoing scream, actually a howl at the top of their voices, "Yush, yush, yush!" But as Smith and Alexander pointed out, neither quite captures the urgent yet supple rhythm of Durkheim's original French. Something is lost. By trying so hard to be vivid, both translations might actually delete the very nuance Durkheim needed to link this frenetic activity to the emergence of logical thought. It's a reminder that striving for one quality vividness can sometimes sacrifice another rhythm or precision. This leads to a bigger issue, omission. When editors create collections or abridgments, they often justify cutting ethnographic material, calling it tangential. But this implies a judgment that the ethnography isn't core to Durkheim's argument. Parsons, however, saw it differently. For him, the ethnographic data was the vehicle for Durkheim's groundbreaking theoretical reasoning, a crucial experiment. Others criticized the limited scope, focusing on just one continent and one people, the Arunta. But the author points out that Durkheim actually studied over 20 Australian peoples. Comparisons were vital for sharpening his concepts. Cutting the ethnography, therefore, isn't just trimming fat. It's seizing the author's turn, preventing readers from engaging with how Durkheim actually worked with his evidence. The goal of retranslating, then, is precisely to give new readers the tools to engage with the full text, including its empirical grounding. And we shouldn't forget Durkheim himself as a translator and stylist. Thanks to Jean Delannoy's analysis, we see that Durkheim wasn't just passively receiving Spencer and Gillen's account, he actively shaped it. He translated almost literally but selectively, correcting what he found repetitive. He played with sentence length and rhythm, intensifying effects. For instance, Spencer and Gillen stand out in strong contrast, became ressortir violemment leap out violently, and the darkness beyond expanded into le fond des ténèbres environnant, the depths of the surrounding darkness. He even invented the pounding cadence, irsh, irsh, irsh. Why? Because he needed this visceral, rhythmic intensity to set up his argument about how thought emerges precisely amidst this kind of sensory and bodily frenzy. His own translation was part of his theoretical construction. The chapter ends with another tricky translation, the final word on religious thought and logic. Durkheim says religious thought uses logical mechanisms awkwardly, but it doesn't ignore any of them. The verb ignorer means both not to know and to pay no attention. How do you translate that double meaning? Swain loses not to know. The author's note loses pay no attention. Rodney Needham loses pay no attention. Only Redding manages to capture both senses with does not overlook. Cladis and Cosman again just delete the whole thing. This highlights how a single word can carry multiple layers of meaning, and how different translators navigate or lose those layers. The choice of word profoundly affects the interpretation of the preceding argument. Sometimes, the problems aren't grand philosophical concepts, but tiny little words. Take the la vie religieuse versus the religious life. La isn't always the c'est la vie, means that's life, not that's the life. Using the religious life implies monasteries, separate spheres, inward spirituality, things elementary forms isn't primarily about. The author even retitled the book Religion and Sociology to avoid this misleading definiteness. Then there's it. French pronouns mark gender, English it is neuter. Look at Durkheim's medical analogy. Le médecin, male physician, cet événement, male event, la maladie, female disease. Swain translates all as it, losing the distinction between the advancing illness, feminine, and the receding point of departure, masculine. This muddies the waters of Durkheim's argument about tracking origins. This brings us back to delire, which Swain translated as delirium. This sparked debate. Critics argue delirium carries too strong a pathological connotation, like delirium tremens. Maybe delusion would be better, preserving Durkheim's insistence on religion's connection to reality while distinguishing it from Freud or Marx. The author pushes back. Durkheim deliberately chose delire, fighting fire with fire on that very terrain. Trying to smooth it over with delusion obscures his strategic choice. The author's strategy was to stick with delirium, a less commonly used English word, forcing the reader to pause and reflect on what Durkheim was actually saying, even if it felt uncomfortable. It's about staying true to the author's potentially provocative language. Let's tackle another tricky pair, holy and sacred. Durkheim establishes the sacred-profane dichotomy as the bedrock of religion. But then later on he uses the word saint-holy repeatedly. What gives? Swain sometimes tried to patch this up, translating saint as sacred instead of holy to keep things consistent with the initial definition. Was that okay? Should the translator smooth over this apparent lapse? To understand, we need to look closer at Durkheim's logic. For him, sacredness isn't inherent, it's created by ritual action. Rites bring about separation. Think of his examples: sacred lice, sacred excrement. The word saint doesn't even appear in the chapter where he defines this process. Why the shift? Maybe ordinary usage interfered with his technical term. Perhaps he wrote those later sections before fully crystallizing the sacred/profane definition. The point is, this distinction is incredibly slippery. It combines two perspectives, like the emperor having and not having clothes simultaneously. Trying to freeze it like Parsons does makes Durkheim's own witty examples fall flat. The author concludes firmly, Swain was wrong to silently repair these shifts. If you're committed to faithfulness to the author, that includes their inconsistencies. And if you're committed to the reader, who doesn't know what holy or sacred means here, you can't just silently switch them. Silent correction betrays both. Now for a different kind of challenge, translating familiar words that have deeply specific, often untranslatable, meanings in Durkheim. Words like conscience, representation, ideal, moral. They look familiar, but they don't mean quite what we expect. An interpretation can take pages to unpack this foreignness, but a translation needs to be brief. Swain often translated conscience simply as mind. It's accurate in one sense, but misses the moral dimension Durkheim often intended. Pickering and Reading, following a convention perhaps influenced by Parsons, claimed conscience and representation defy translation. Their solution? Italicize them and send readers to Luke's biography, which spends 5 pages dissecting them. But the author rightly points out, this is a specific fix for a specific problem. It doesn't offer a general strategy for translating the whole book. Parsons himself recommended leaving conscience untranslated to avoid bias towards its cognitive meaning consciousness. But if we leave it untranslated to preserve its moral sense, then we have to scrutinize moral too. Look at Durkheim saying social forces are moral and at the same time efficacious. Swain's translation moral and at the same time efficacious creates a false contrast typical of English moral meaning normative. Reading's moral as well as effective is better. The author tried moral yet mighty, Cosman moral and forceful. Still feels off. The problem is moral itself. It needs a different sense, perhaps pertaining to spirit or thought, not just norms or action. This fits with moral power, the efficacy of the right, language as consciousness of consciousnesses. So which moral did Parsons mean in one moral community called a church? Likely the one related to shared spirit or thought, not just shared norms. This leads us back to the soul. In the idea of soul, Durkheim discusses the soul as a generic essence, real but without extension, contrasting with the body. This echoes Descartes' res extensa body versus res cogitans thinking thing. For Durkheim's audience, this reference would have been obvious. With this understanding, we can revisit that monster sentence. Nothing comes out of nothing. From something tangible, one can only make something tangible. From extended substance, one cannot make unextended substance. It means we add something imagined yet real, possessing objectivity but not materiality. Words like moral, ideal, spiritual, social, and of course sacré all cluster around this mind or soul side of Durkheim's terrain, carrying meanings distinct from their English counterparts. Conscience and representation are right there with them. How do we translate representation? Beck advised, the idea of something present to the mind. Simple. The verb so representer means present to the mind, imagine, picture. Avoid represent to oneself, which sounds weird. It can also mean remember or recall, as in commemorative rites. The non-reflexive representer means stand for, symbolize, but beware. Everyday English lacks the performative power shown in Durkheim's examples, where the Warramungas make their immemorial past present through ritual. Representation is ambiguous, capacity or content, process or product, thinking or thought, mind inside or outside individuals. Armed with this understanding, we can revisit that dropped passage. The sacred beings exist only in and through their representations. With representation meaning shared, constructed reality, we see that sacredness requires collective witnessing, defining a shared world. This leads to the idea of an imagined community, like Parsons Church, bound by shared representations that constitute their shared reality. So translation isn't just swapping words, it's navigating layers of meaning, historical context, and stylistic choices. Jerome reminds us it's an act of creation, of adding and changing, like an artisan rebuilding a house, not a medium passively relaying a message. The original provides the blueprint, but the translator builds the structure. And inevitably, something is gained, something is lost in the process.